We're getting to the end of this book now. Roald Dahl, Stanley Champion of the World, chapter 19. At 8:30 the next morning, my father went into the workshop and dialed Doc Spencer's number on the telephone. "Now listen, Doc," he said. "If you could be here at the filling station in about half an hour, I think I might have a little surprise present for you." The doctor said something in reply, and my father replaced the receiver. At 9 o'clock, Doc Spencer arrived in his car. My father went over to him, and the two of them held a whispered conversation beside the pumps. Suddenly, the tiny doctor clapped his hands together and sprang up high in the air, hooting with laughter. "You don't mean it," he cried. "It's not possible." He then rushed over to me and grasped my hand in his. "I do congratulate you, my dear boy," he cried, pumping up my hand up and down so fiercely it nearly came off. "What a triumph! What a miracle! What a victory! Now, why on earth did I think of that method myself? You are a genius, sir. Hail to 3. Dear Danny, you are the champion of the world. Here she comes," my father called out, pointing down the road. "Here she comes, doctor." "Here who comes?" the doctor said. "Mrs. Clipstone." He spoke the name proudly as though he were a commander referring to his bravest officer. The three of us stood together beside the pumps looking down the road. "Can't you see her?" my father asked. Far away in the distance, I could just make out a small figure advancing towards us. "What's she pushing, Dad?" My father gave me a sly look. "There's only one way of delivering pheasants safely," he said, "and that's under a baby. Isn't that right, Doctor?" "Under a baby?" Doc Spencer said. "Of course, it's a pram, and the baby on top." "Fantastic," the doctor said. "My old dad thought that one up many years ago," my father said, "and it's never been known to fail yet." "It's brilliant," Dr. Spencer said. "Only a brilliant mind could think of a thing like that." "He was a brilliant man," my father said. "Can you see her now, Doctor? And that'll be young Christopher Clipstone sitting up in the pram. He's 1.5, a lovely child." "I birthed him," Doc Spencer said. "He weighed 8 pounds 3 ounces. I could just make out the small dot of the baby sitting high up in the pram, which had its hood folded down. "There's more than 100 pheasants under that little nipper," my father said happily. "Just imagine it." "You can't put 100 pheasants in a child's pram, you know," Dr. Spencer said. "Don't be ridiculous." "You can if it's been specifically made for the job," my father said. "This one is built extra long, extra wide, and it's got an extra deep well underneath. Listen, you could push a cow around in there if you wanted to, let alone 100 pheasants and a baby." "Did you make it yourself, Dad?" I asked. "More or less, Danny. You remember when I walked you to school and went off to buy the raisins? That day before yesterday," I said. "Yes, and after that I went straight to the vicarage and converted their pram into this special extra large poacher's model. It's a beauty, really, isn't it? You wait till you see it, and Mrs. Clipstone says it pushes even easier than our ordinary one. She did a practice circuit with it in her backyard as soon as I'd finished it." "Fantastic," the doctor said again. "Absolutely fantastic." "Normally," my father went on, "an ordinary bought pram is all you'd never need. But then no one's ever had 100 pheasants to deliver before now." "Where does the baby sit?" the doctor asked. "On top, of course," my father asked. "All you need is a sheet to cover them, and the baby sits on the sheet. A bunch of pheasants makes a nice soft mattress for any child." "I don't doubt it," the doctor said. "He'll be having a very comfortable ride today, young Christopher," my father said. We stood beside the pumps waiting for Mrs. Clipstone to arrive. It was 1st of October, and one of those warm, windless autumn mornings with a darkening sky and the smell of thunder in the air. What was so marvellous about my father, I thought, was the way he always surprised you. It was impossible to be with him for long without being surprised and astounded by one of the thing or another. He was like a conjurer, bringing things out of a hat. Right now, it was the pram and the baby. In a few minutes, it would be something else again. I felt sure of that. Right through the village, bold as brass, my father said. "Good for her." "She seems in an awful hurry, Dad," I said. "She's sort of half running. Don't you think she's sort of half running, Dr. Spencer?" "I imagine she's a bit anxious to unload her cargo," the doctor said. My father squinted down the road at the approaching figure. "She appears to be going to be quick." "Oh, she's going very quick," I said. There was a pause. My father was beginning to stare hard at the lady in the distance. "Perhaps she doesn't want to be caught in the rain," he said. "I'll bet exactly what it is. She thinks it's going to rain and she doesn't want the baby to get wet." She could put the hood up, I said. He didn't answer this. She's running, Doc Spencer said. Look! It was true. Mrs. Clipson had suddenly broken into a full sprint. My father stood very still, staring at her, and in the silence that followed, I fancied I could hear a baby screaming. What's up, Dad? He didn't reply. There's something wrong with the baby. Doc Spencer said, listen. At that point, Mrs. Clipson was about 200 yards away from us, but closing fast. Can you hear him now, Dad? Yes, I can hear him. He's yelling his head off, Doc Spencer said. The small, shrill voice in the distance was growing louder every second, frantic, piercing, non-stop. He's having a fit, my father said. It's a good thing we've got a doctor handy. Doc Spencer didn't say anything. That's why she's running, Doctor, my father said. He's having a fit and she wants to get him out of here as quick as possible under a cold tap. Some noise, I said. If it isn't a fit, my father said, you can bet your life it's something like it. I doubt it's a fit, the doctor said. My father shifted his feet uneasily on the ground of the driveway. There's 1,001 different things keep happening every day in little babies like that, he said. That's right, isn't it, Doctor? Of course, Doc Spencer said. Every day. I knew a baby once who caught his fingers in the spokes of a pram wheel. It cut them clean off. The doctor smiled. Whatever it is, my father said, I wish to heavens she'd stop running. It'll give the game away. A long lorry loaded with bricks came up behind the pram and the driver slowed down and poked his head out to the window to stare. Mrs. Clipstone ignored him and flew on. She was close now. I could see her big red face with a mouth wide open, panting for breath. I noticed she was wearing white gloves on her hands, very prim and dainty, and there was a funny little white hat to match, perched right on the top of her head like a mushroom. Suddenly, out of the pram, straight up into the air, flew an enormous pheasant. My father let out a cry of horror. The fallen lorry began roaring with laughter. The pheasant flapped around drunkenly for a few seconds, then lost height and landed on the grass by the side of the road. Crikey, Doc Smith said, look at that. A grocer's van came up behind the lorry and began hooting to get Mrs. Clipstone. It kept on running. Then whoosh, a second pheasant flew up out of the pram. Then a third and a fourth. Great Scott, Doc Spencer. I know what's happened. It's the sleeping pills they're wearing off. My father didn't say a word. Mrs. Clipstone covered the last 50 yards at a tremendous pace. She came swinging up into the filling station with birds flying out of the pram in all directions. What on earth is happening? She shrieked. She pulled up sharp against the first pump and seized the screaming infant in her arms and dragged him clear. With the weight of the child suddenly lifted away, the great cloud of pheasants rose up out of the gigantic pram. There must have been well over 100 of them, and the whole sky was filled with huge brown birds clapping their wings. A sleeping pill doesn't last forever, Doc Spencer said, shaking his head sadly. It always wears off by the next morning. The pheasants were too dopey to fly far. In a few seconds they came down again and settled themselves like a swarm of locusts all over the filling station. The place was covered with them. They sat wing to wing along the roof of the workshop, and about a dozen were clinging to the sill of the office window. Some had flown down onto the rack that held the bottles of the lubricating oil, and others were sliding about on the bonnet of Doc Spencer's car. One cockbird with a fine tail was perched superbly on top of a petrol pump, and quite a number of those were too drunk to do anything else, simply squatted in the driveway at our feet, fluffing their feathers and blinking their small eyes. My father stayed remarkably calm, but not poor Mrs. Clipstone. They nearly pecked him to pieces. She was crying, clasping the screaming baby to her bosom. Take him into the caravan, Mrs. Clipstone, my father said. All these birds are making him nervous. And Danny pushed the pram into the workshop quick. Mrs. Clipstone disappeared into our caravan with the baby. I pushed the pram into the workshop across the road. A line of cars had already started forming behind the brick lorry and the grocery van. People were opening their doors and getting out, beginning to cross over to stare at the pheasants. Watch out, Dad, I said. Look, who's here? Chapter 20. The big, shiny silver Rolls Royce had braked suddenly and come to a stop right alongside the filling station. Behind the wheel, I could see an enormous pink, beery face of Mr. Victor Hazel staring at the pheasants. I could see his mouth hanging open, the eyes bulging out of his head like toadstools, and the skin on his face turning from pink to bright scarlet. The car door opened and out he came, resplendent in fawn-coloured riding breeches and high-polished boots. There was a yellow silk scarf with red dots on it around his neck, and he had a sort of bowler hat on his head. The great shooting party was about to begin, and he was on his way to greet the guests. He left the door of the Rolls-Royce open, came up to us like a charging bull. My father, Doc Spencer, and I stood close together like in a small little group, waiting for him. He started shouting at us the moment he got out of the car, and he went on shouting for a long time after that. I am sure you would like to know what he said, but I cannot possibly repeat it here. The language he used was so foul and filthy, it scorched my ear holes. Words came out of his mouth that I had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. Little flecks of white foam began foaming around his lips and running down his chin onto the yellow silk scarf. I glanced at my father. He was standing very still and very calm, waiting for the shouting to finish. The colour was back in his cheeks now, and I could see the tiny, twinkling wrinkles of smile around the corner of his eyes. Doc Spencer stood beside him, and he also was very calm. He was looking at Mr. Hazel rather as one would look at a slug on a leaf of lettuce in the salad. I myself did not feel quite so calm. But they are not your pheasants, my father said at last. They're mine. Don't lie to me, man, yelled Mr. Hazel. I'm the only person around who has the pheasants. They are on my land, my father said quietly. They flew onto my land, and so long as they stay on my land, they belong to me. Don't you know the rules, you bloated old blue-faced baboon? Doc Spencer started to giggle. Mr. Hazel's skin turned from scarlet to purple. His eyes and his cheeks were bulging so much with rage it looked as though someone was blowing up his face with a pump. He glared at my father, then he glared at the dopey pheasants swarming all over the filling station. What's the matter with them? He shouted. What have you done to them? At this point, pedalling grandly towards us on his black bicycle came the arm of the law in the shape of Sergeant Enoch Samways. Resplendent in his blue uniform and shiny silver buttons, it was always a mystery to me how Sergeant Samways could sniff out trouble wherever it was. Let there be a few boys fighting on the pavement or two motorists arguing over a dented bumper, and you could bet your life the village policeman would be there within minutes. We all saw him coming now, and a little hush fell upon the entire company. I imagine the same sort of thing happens when a king or a president enters a room full of chattering people. They all stop talking and stand very still as a mark of respect for a powerful, important person. Sergeant Samways dismounted from his bicycle and threaded his way carefully through the mass of pheasants squatting on the ground. The face behind the big black moustache showed no surprise, no anger, no emotion of any kind. It was calm and neutral, as the face of the law should always be. For a full half-minute, he allowed his eyes to travel slowly around the filling station, gazing at the mass of pheasants squatting all over the place. The rest of us, including even Mr. Hazel, waited in silence for judgment to be pronounced. Well, 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 said Sergeant Samways at last, puffing his chest out and addressing nobody in particular. What, may I ask, is happening here? Sergeant Samways had a funny habit of sometimes putting the letter H in front of words that shouldn't have them, an H there at all. And as though to balance things out, he would take away the H from all the words that should have begun with that letter. I'll tell you what's happened around here, shouted Mr. Hazel, advancing upon the policeman. These are my pheasants, and this rogue, pointing at my father, has enticed them out of the woods onto his filthy little filling station. Hence, said Sergeant Samways, looking first at Mr. Hazel, then at us. Hence them, did you say? Of course he enticed them. Well, now, said the sergeant, propping his bicycle carefully against one of our pumps. This is a very interesting accusation, very interesting indeed. Because I ain't never heard of nobody enticing a pheasant across 6 miles of fields, an open countryside. How do you think this enticing was performed, Mr. Hazel, if I may ask? Don't ask me how he did it, because I don't know, shouted Mr. Hazel, but he's done it all right. The proof is all around you. All my finest birds are sitting here in this dirty little filling station when they ought to be up in my own wood getting ready to be for the shoot. The words poured out of Mr. Hazel's mouth like hot lava from an erupting volcano. Am I correct, said Sergeant Samways, am I absolutely accurate in thinking that that today is the day of your great shooting party, Mr. Hazel? That's the whole point, cried Mr. Hazel, stabbing his forefinger in his servant's chest as though he were punching a typewriter or adding machine. And if I don't get these birds back up to my land quick sharp, some very important people are going to be extremely angry this morning. And one of my guests, I have you know, Sergeant, is none other than your boss, the Chief Constable of the county. So you'd better do something about it fast, hadn't you? Unless you want to lose your sergeant stripes of yours. And that is it for today. Very exciting. 1.5 chapters to go. Very exciting.